On the morning of the 15th of July, 1685, a crowd gathered on Tower Hill to watch James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, die. He was no common criminal. He was the illegitimate son of Charles II, the figurehead of a failed rebellion, and for a few brief weeks he had looked, to some in England, like a possible king. What waited for him at the scaffold was John Ketch, better known as Jack Ketch, the public executioner whose name had already become a curse. And what happened next was so ugly that it burned the trade into memory for all the wrong reasons. Ketch did not take Monmouth's head cleanly. He struck once, then again, then again. Witnesses said it took 5 blows, and when even that failed, a knife had to finish the work. The crowd, which had come for justice or spectacle or both, turned furious. They shouted at Ketch. Some threatened him. In one of the most public moments in Stuart England, the man who served the law became the object of the crowd's disgust. Most people remember scenes like that and assume the executioner was simply a brute with an axe. But that tidy picture is wrong. The botched death of Monmouth was not the whole story of the trade. It was only one crack in the surface. Behind that scaffold stood an older world that reached back through German cities, French dynasties, market privileges, civic ritual, and a whole web of dirty work respectable people refused to touch. Because the truth is stranger than the legend, the executioner was not outside society. He was buried deep inside it. Towns feared him, shunned him, paid him, used him, and in a grim way depended on him. He could kill in public for the state and still be treated like a contaminant in the street. He could stand at the center of law and remain an outcast from ordinary human company. And if you want to understand how one of the most hated men in every town became one of the most necessary, you do not start on Tower Hill in 1685. You start much earlier, in a world where punishment was local, public, intimate, and where the state needed somebody to put his hands on death. The trade did not begin with prestige, training, or willing applicants. It began in many places with coercion. A town needed sentences carried out. Bodies had to be whipped, branded, mutilated, or killed under legal authority. But very few respectable men wanted to touch that work. So early European societies solved the problem the brutal way they solved so many others, by pushing it downward onto the already doomed. In parts of Northern Europe, including Sweden, a condemned man could sometimes escape his own death by taking the office himself. The choice was not freedom. It was transformation. Die now, or live on as the executioner. That meant survival purchased at the price of permanent dishonor. You stepped away from the scaffold only by becoming part of it. England produced its own version of that logic in the life of Thomas Derrick. In 1596, after the Earl of Essex's expedition to Cadiz, Derrick was one of 24 sailors condemned to hang. According to the later tradition attached to his name, he was spared on one condition: he must execute his fellow prisoners. Whether every detail of that story can be recovered exactly, the broad outline is well established. Derrick lived, the others did not, and the spared man entered the trade that respectable society would not choose for itself. He then spent years as London's hangman, working at Tyburn, the great execution site west of the city where carts, ropes, prayers, and crowds turned punishment into ritual. You can feel the logic of the age in that one career. The state did not seek a philosopher of justice. It needed hands. Strong hands, steady hands, hands willing to do what others would only watch. That is the first surprise in this story. The executioner was often not born from honor into duty, but driven into office through disgrace, compulsion, or family entrapment. The trade answered a problem every authority faced. Sentences are only words until someone enforces them. A judge could condemn, a prince could decree, a council could pass sentence. None of it meant anything until one man tied the rope, raised the sword, or pushed the body toward death. And once that necessity became permanent, the office changed. Towns stopped improvising. They began appointing specialists. Families formed. Skills were passed down. Shame itself became hereditary. The man who first took the post might have done so under pressure. His children would inherit the stigma as if it were blood. If you want to hear the trade speak in its own voice, you do not go to a judge, a priest, or a pamphleteer. You go to a notebook kept by a man named Franz Schmidt. He was born in 1555, and the path that trapped his family was already marked before he could choose it. His father, Henri Schmidt, had not come from a line of executioners. He was forced into the role when the Margrave at Hof used an old prerogative to compel him. In other words, the family fell not through crime, but through power. Franz entered the work young. On the 5th of June 1573, at 19 years old, He carried out his first execution at Steinach, a thief named Leinhard Russ, hanged by the rope. According to the surviving account, once it was done, an older executioner slapped the young man 3 times in ritual confirmation that he had joined the ranks of master headsmen. It is one of those details history sometimes preserves with terrible clarity. Not a grand oath, not a medal. 3 blows to welcome him into a life of sanctioned death. From 1578 to 1617, Schmidt served mainly as executioner of Nuremberg, one of the great imperial cities of the Holy Roman Empire. Over that long career, he recorded 361 executions in his journal, along with many lesser punishments: flogging, mutilation, branding, and torture. He was methodical, professional, and startlingly restrained on the page. No boasting, no theatrical bloodlust, just cases, methods, names, outcomes. It reads less like confession than ledger. That is part of what makes it so unsettling. But the diary hides a second life. Schmidt was not only killing for the city, he was healing in the margins of it. Sources connected to his career say he treated thousands of patients over 4.5 decades, using practical medicine on people who would trust his hands in private, while recoiling from them in public. He was needed twice over, first to punish, then to cure. The German word hovering over his life was Ehrlosigkeit, meaning legal dishonor. It was not merely insult, it was civic pollution, a formal status that could cling to a household across generations. Schmidt's great ambition was not wealth or fame, it was rehabilitation. He wanted his children out. He wanted the family name restored. That is the deeper beginning of the executioner as a trade. Not simply the making of a technician of death, but the making of a hereditary outcast whose entire life would be shaped by a contradiction. The law trusted him with violence, and society punished him for obeying it. Picture a respectable old town in early modern Europe. The church bell rings, the market opens, bakers sell loaves, butchers dress carcasses, magistrates hear disputes. And somewhere, often at the physical edge of that neat civic world, lives the man who handles everything nobody else wants to touch. Not just the condemned, everything foul, troublesome, contaminated, or morally dangerous. That was the executioner's wider kingdom. In France, he could be called the maître des hautes bas-œuvres, the master of high and low works. The high works were the punishments we remember: hangings, beheadings, whippings, mutilations, the public choreography of pain. The low works were the other duties that filled ordinary days. Smithsonian's account of the office preserves the list with almost comic brutality. Executioners managed latrines and cesspools. They dealt with stray dogs and carcasses. They enforced livestock regulations. They could collect tribute from lepers and prostitutes. They might supervise gaming houses or profit when those houses were shut down. In other words, the executioner was not rare punctuation in public life. He was woven into municipal maintenance. A cleaner city, a more regulated market, a more disciplined street life often meant more use for him, not less. Civilization did not eliminate the trade. It specialized it. That is one of the great reversals here. We imagine the executioner as a relic of barbarism. Yet the more organized a city became, the more roles it found for him. He was a border guard of morality, policing the line between the clean and the defiled, the lawful and the forbidden, the living citizen and the socially dead. And he was paid accordingly, not always with honor, but with rights. In parts of France, he possessed the droit de havage, the right to seize a fixed quantity of goods from the marketplace. Vendors had to drop cakes, eggs, garlic, herring, and other provisions into his bag or spoon. Even that ritual revealed the stigma. Often he was not meant to touch the food directly, for fear of contamination. Yet the food was his by law. So the same man who swung a sword on the scaffold might clean the town's filth, regulate its margins, and leave market day with his due. He was indispensable precisely because he handled what everyone else disowned. And that civic usefulness created a puzzle authorities never solved. How do you keep depending on a man you also insist must remain apart? Because respectable guilds would not take them. Executioners built something stranger, a network without dignity, but with memory. In ordinary trades, a boy learned from a master, entered a corporation, married into a respectable family, and inherited standing along with skill. For executioners, the same mechanics existed in distorted form. Apprenticeship still mattered. Marriage still mattered. Family alliances still mattered. But the whole system operated in the shadows, among people shunned by everyone else. This is how executioner dynasties appeared across Europe. Fathers trained sons, daughters married sons of other executioners. Vacancies in nearby towns were filled through kinship. Endogamy, marriage within the group, was not a quaint custom. It was survival. If respectable households would not marry you, you married where you could. Over generations, the trade became its own interlinked social world, almost a grim parallel guild. France offers the clearest example. The Guillaume family dominated the Paris office before being followed by the Sansons. Charles Sanson was appointed in 1688. His descendants served before, during, and after the Revolution. By the time Charles Henri Sanson rose to prominence in the 18th century, the office had become both hereditary and unmistakably national. One family stood at the blade edge of the state for generations. Smithsonian's account notes just how far such family lines could spread. The same surnames appear in town after town, not because executioners were beloved, but because they had so few social options beyond one another. What looks at first like a freakish exception turns out to be a system. Europe solved the problem of who would kill for the law by breeding specialists and then walling them inside their own inheritance. And yet this hidden fraternity had real professional standards. A botched execution could produce riots. A clean one proved skill. Schmidt's career in Nuremberg shows authorities actively preferring competent, disciplined men over the drunken or openly criminal types who had once filled the role. The trade became more professional as the surrounding society became more orderly. So here is the next reveal. The executioner did not belong to no world. He belonged to a sealed one. It had its own marriages, apprenticeships, reputations, and routes from town to town. It carried knowledge across borders while living beneath contempt. By now you can see the shape of the paradox. The office that polite society treated as polluted was also becoming more stable, more specialized, and more central to state power. And once that happened, the executioner ceased to be merely a servant of punishment. He became, in certain places, a man standing very near money. The cart has gone. The old axe has gone. In their place stands a new machine in a new age. On the 21st of January 1793, in revolutionary Paris, Louis XVI mounted the scaffold and met not a hooded medieval figure, but the modern state in sharpened form. The man responsible for carrying out the sentence was Charles-Henri Sanson, High Executioner of France, already famous long before he put a king to death. That one scene can trick us. It is tempting to see Sanson as merely the grim functionary of the revolution, dragged into history by events larger than himself. But by then the office he held had already accumulated title, continuity, and wealth. He belonged to the most famous executioner dynasty in France. His family had turned necessity into institution, and he worked not in some forgotten provincial yard, but at the heart of national theater. Sanson's career touched astonishing moments. He oversaw the first execution by guillotine in 1792, when Nicolas Jacques Pelletier died at the Place de Grève. Less than a year later, he executed the king who had once employed him as royal officer. During the Terror, the pace accelerated into something close to industrial rhythm. Thousands died by guillotine in Paris and beyond. Crowds gathered, carts rolled, blades fell. The office did not shrink under revolution. It expanded with it. One modern account credits Charles-Henri Sanson with 2,918 executions across his career. Whether every tally can be reconstructed with equal certainty, the broad truth is plain enough. He was not a marginal butcher. He was one of the state's most visible technicians. He handled what law, monarchy, and republic alike required at their most dramatic moments. That made the office powerful in a peculiar way. Sanson did not write policy. He did not command armies. He did not vote laws. Yet on the day Louis XVI died, the fate of a dynasty ended not in theory, but in his hands and under his supervision. That is a form of proximity to power few trades have ever possessed. He stood where sovereignty became flesh, and where flesh was cut away. The deeper surprise is that the office's prestige could rise even while its stigma remained. Executioners were still feared, still ostracized, still marked. But in Paris, by the late 18th century, the state also made them officers of immense visibility. They stood between sentence and finality. Without them, even revolution could not complete its work. A humble trade had become leverage. It had moved from the town's edge to the center of political drama. And once there, it began to draw serious money from the very public that shuddered at its touch. Imagine a condemned family in an early modern town, still clinging to the last dignity money might buy. The sentence is fixed. The body will die. But one question remains agonizingly open. Will the death be clean? A single sure stroke of the sword, especially in places where beheading marked rank, required skill. A clumsy executioner could turn punishment into butchery. That fear created one of the grimmest economies in the old world. Executioners earned official salaries, but salary was only the beginning. In some towns, they received fees for particular tasks. In others, they possessed side rights and perquisites, meaning legal extras attached to the office. They could claim the clothes of the condemned. They could keep the rope. They could profit from carcasses, skins, market rights, and the whole dark fringe economy of the low works. The trade repelled society, but it also absorbed its refuse and converted it into income. French evidence shows just how wealthy some families became. Smithsonian notes that Jean Guillaume, executioner of Paris from 1594, an ancestor to a large line of later executioners, amassed enough money to receive an elaborate funeral attended by 30 priests. That is not the burial of a starving outcast. That is a man whose office, however despised, had accumulated hard cash and public weight. The market privilege called droit d'avage mattered too. Goods taken from vendors in the open marketplace were not symbolic crumbs. They were lawful income, an everyday reminder that civic order fed the man who enforced its ugliest edge. He might leave the scaffold hated and return from the market supplied. And then there was competence itself. Sources from the period and later scholarship alike make clear that skill had value. A clean stroke spared scandal. A bungled one invited fury. Municipal authorities wanted orderly punishment because disorder on the scaffold undermined authority in the square below. In that sense, the executioner sold not only death, but control. This is where the trade stops looking like a mere social embarrassment and starts resembling a municipal monopoly. Few men wanted the office. Fewer could perform it well. Authorities protected the role because the role solved too many problems to let it lapse. The work contaminated the worker, but that contamination created scarcity, and scarcity could be profitable. So the executioner became one of the strangest figures in the economic life of old Europe. Wealthy enough in some places to prosper, useful enough to be protected, hated enough to remain untouchable. He could draw income from death, filth, and public fear all at once. And if that sounds like power, it was. But it was power with a curse on it. And by the time we reach the people inside that curse, the story darkens sharply. The most important thing to understand about the executioner is that he did not merely perform death. In the eyes of many neighbors, he carried a kind of death around with him. His disgrace was expected to cling, to spread, to stain. In German lands, the status could be described through the language of dishonor. In France, too, executioners were marked, feared, and socially isolated. This was not simple unpopularity. It was structured exclusion. Joel Harrington's work on Franz Schmidt captures the contradiction painfully well. Schmidt was trusted by Nuremberg to execute sentences and valued enough that thousands came to him privately for medical treatment. Yet the wider social isolation remained intense. His house itself stood on an island, in a telling position between a respectable neighborhood and a prison. Geography made the moral point visible. He belonged between worlds, not fully admitted to either. People could believe his touch brought contamination. That seems irrational now, but it had practical consequences then. Dishonorable status meant obstacles to legal rights, marriage, office, and ordinary social recognition. The children of executioners inherited the burden. You could be born already excluded by work you had never done. That is why Schmidt's long campaign for rehabilitation matters so much. He retired in 1617 after decades of service. In 1624, he petitioned Emperor Ferdinand II to restore his family's honor, not for vanity, for escape. He wanted his descendants free of the civic stigma attached to his profession. After a lifetime of dutiful service, that was the victory he cared about most. Pause on that for a moment. Here was a man trusted to inflict the law's final violence on behalf of an imperial city. A man disciplined enough to record 361 executions. A man sought out as a healer. And what he wanted, above all, was simply for his children to be allowed back into respectable society. That is the human wound at the center of the trade. The executioner lived where usefulness and shame met. He might perform his office flawlessly and still watch artisans, innkeepers, and householders keep their distance. He might save lives with medicine and still remain polluted in law or custom. He served the city while being denied full belonging in it. When we talk about old trades vanishing, nostalgia can make everything look handcrafted and honorable. This story resists that comfort. The executioner's world was skilled, necessary, and often cruelly isolating. Not only for the condemned, but for the man ordered to condemn them. And yet by the modern era, even that old burden would take on a new shape. The stigma remained, but the man carrying it began to speak in a different voice. At a small pub in Hollinwood, near Oldham, a man named Albert Pierrepoint, pulled pints for regulars under the sign "Help the Poor Struggler." If you had walked in during the late 1940s, you might have known him as the landlord before you knew him as anything else. He was quiet, courteous, and by then already Britain's most accomplished hangman. That double life is strange enough. Stranger still is what happened when one of his own regulars came to the end of a rope Pierrepoint himself would fix. James Henri Corbett was a familiar face in the pub. He and Pierrepoint even sang together, "Danny Boy," as drinking companions sometimes do. Pierrepoint called him Tish. Corbett called Pierrepoint Tosh. Then in 1950, Corbett murdered his girlfriend Eliza Wood in a jealous rage. He was convicted. On the 28th of November 1950, at Strangeways Prison in Manchester, the man who had shared a song with him performed the execution. You can search the history of this trade for a cleaner moral collision, and you will struggle to find one. Pierrepoint knew the condemned man, not abstractly, socially, casually, humanly, and he still had to bind him, hood him, and send him through the trap in the efficient seconds for which he was famous. Later, Pierrepoint reflected on that case in words that cut deeper than any political speech. "If any man should have been deterred from murder," he wrote, "it was this man, who not only knew the rope existed but had drunk beside the man who handled it. Yet the deterrent did not work." From that experience and many others, Pierrepoint drew the bleak conclusion that capital punishment had prevented no murder at all. This matters because Pierrepoint was no distant critic. He was the craft at its most polished. He served from the 1930s until resigning in 1956, hanged Nazi war criminals after the Second World War, and became the best-known British executioner of the 20th century. Estimates of his total executions vary, but they run above 400 and often much higher. When such a man says the trade failed in its own declared purpose, the statement lands with unusual force. By Pierrepoint's day, the old magical pollution surrounding executioners had faded in Britain. He could run a pub. He could live more normally than Franz Schmidt ever could. But the inner burden had not vanished. It had merely changed form. The shame was less public. The doubt was more personal. That is the great late reveal of the human cost. The executioner did not only carry the hatred of others. Sometimes, after years of professional perfection, he carried a judgment against the trade itself. And once that doubt enters the story, extinction is no longer far behind. For centuries, the executioner's value lay partly in skill. A hanging had to be managed. A sword had to land true. A crowd had to be controlled. Even cruelty had a craft logic to it. Then, in the last years of the 18th century, a machine arrived that changed the balance. On the 25th of April 1792, at the Place de Grève in Paris, the highwayman Nicolas Jacques Pelletier became the first man executed by guillotine. The blade fell, and with it fell something of the old executioner's art. The guillotine is often remembered as a symbol of revolutionary bloodshed, and of course it was that. But it was also a device for standardization. Named after Joseph Ignace Guillotine in popular memory, though shaped technically by others including Antoine Louis, it promised equality in death and efficiency in procedure. Instead of relying on the varying skill of a headsman, the state could rely on weight, angle, mechanism. Gravity became the executioner's best assistant. That did not eliminate the office overnight. Men like Henri Sanson still prepared the condemned, supervised the process, and maintained order around the scaffold. But the emphasis shifted. A spectacular craft was becoming an administered routine. The executioner moved one step farther from the individual stroke. The same pattern repeated elsewhere as modern states searched for cleaner, more reliable, or supposedly more humane killing technologies. In the United States, the electric chair first killed William Kemmler in 1890. It, too, was sold as a technical answer to a moral problem. Later came gas chambers and lethal injection. Each innovation claimed progress. Each also reduced the older figure of the executioner. He became less a master of bodily technique and more an operator inside a process. That is the irony. The trade that had professionalized so carefully was finally threatened by professionalism of another kind. Engineers, doctors, legislators, and administrators redesigning death until the ancient specialist no longer looked necessary. And something else changed with the machine. The act itself became easier to hide behind procedure. A sword leaves no illusion. A rope, no matter how efficient, still demands presence. But a device lets society imagine death has become technical rather than human, as if killing, once mechanized, ceases to belong to anyone in particular. That illusion was fatal to the old trade. The executioner lost not only methods, but identity. The guillotine made him a supervisor of a blade. Later systems made him a functionary in a sealed room. The more modern punishment became, the less visible its ancient craftsman appeared. And once the craftsman is stripped from the craft, the office can disappear with startling speed. Albert Pierrepoint resigned in 1956 over a fee dispute, but his departure felt larger than money. By then the old confidence was draining away. Britain still executed, but uneasily. Wrongful convictions such as that of Timothy Evans had shaken public trust. The rope remained in law, yet the moral world around it had changed. The hangman was no longer the feared civic necessity of earlier centuries. He was beginning to look like a leftover. The end came quickly. On the 13th of August 1964, Peter Anthony Allen and Gwyn Owen Evans were hanged in Liverpool and Manchester, the last judicial executions in Britain. In 1965, Parliament suspended the death penalty for murder, and that suspension later became permanent. A trade that had stretched from Tyburn carts to modern prisons was suddenly finished in its British form. No more official hangman waiting in reserve. No new Pierrepoint to inherit the work. France kept its executioner longer, but even there the line was breaking. The guillotine, once hailed as rational and modern, grew archaic in the public imagination. Its final use in France came on the 10th of September 1977, when Hamida Gendoubi was executed in Marseille. The date shocks many people because it is so recent. Not the Middle Ages, not the Revolution. 1977. The old blade was still falling when disco records were on the radio. Then came the legal end. On the 17th of September 1981, Justice Minister Robert Badinter stood before the French National Assembly and argued for abolition. The law itself passed on the 9th of October 1981. France's official statement later described that act as a step forward for human dignity. Whatever one's view of capital punishment, that date marks a clear institutional burial. An office that had once stood in every older order of Europe was legislated out of existence. Notice how abrupt the last chapter feels. For generations, the executioner had seemed permanent. Kingdoms changed, religions fractured, revolutions erupted, and still the trade survived. Then modern legal systems, changing public sensibilities, and new ideas of rights closed around it. What families had inherited for centuries vanished within living memory. That is the extinction people rarely notice. We remember kings beheaded and rebels hanged. We remember the condemned. We almost never pause over the worker whose role made those sentences real, and who then disappeared when the moral machinery of the state shifted under him. So the trade ended not with one final dramatic blow, but with something quieter, and in its own way more absolute. No successor appointed, no son trained, no office left to inherit. After all those centuries, the most hated man in every town simply ceased to be a trade at all. So now the whole long arc comes back into view. The botched horror on Tower Hill in 1685, the condemned sailor turned hangman, the 19-year-old Franz Schmidt writing down his first death at Steinach, the Nuremberg healer who killed for the law and begged the emperor to free his children from the stain, the executioner collecting market dues, skimming profit from carcasses, regulating gaming houses, emptying cesspools, and then stepping onto the scaffold as if all of old civic life narrowed into one profession. The Sansons carrying the office through 6 generations until Charles Henri Sanson stood in Paris and sent a king into history. The pub landlord in Hollinwood who hanged a man he knew and lived long enough to doubt the purpose of the work he had perfected. The guillotine. The last British hangings in 1964. France ending the office in law on the 9th of October 1981. What makes this story linger is not simply its cruelty, it is its reach. The executioner was never some gothic extra standing outside the real world. He helped make the real world legible. He showed where the state ended argument and began force. He marked the edge between law and body. He absorbed the filth, fear, and hypocrisy a town could not admit into polite hands. He built no cathedral, forged no rail, launched no ship. Yet for centuries, towns and kingdoms could not imagine doing without him. And now almost nobody remembers he was once a full profession with rules, dynasties, side incomes, rivalries, skills, and a place in everyday municipal life. That is the real shock, not that executioners existed. Of course they did. It is that they were everywhere, structured, inherited, and woven into ordinary society far more deeply than most of us ever think. Some traces remain, if you know where to look. The word derrick, attached now to cranes and oil rigs, is widely traced to Thomas Derrick, the Elizabethan hangman whose name became attached to a lifting frame. Surnames like Sanson survive long after the office itself is gone. Old execution grounds, prison walls, Courthouse squares and street names still sit in towns that barely notice what they once staged there. Even more than that, the moral shape of the trade survives in a quieter form. We still ask states to punish, but we prefer not to see the hands that do it. And that brings us back to Jack Ketch and the 5 blows. The crowd that day was not only recoiling from a botched beheading, it was recoiling from the one man who made visible a truth society always wants hidden. Punishment is never abstract for long. In the end, someone must carry it out. If this history surprised you, and if you enjoy these forgotten trades and lost worlds behind everyday life, subscribe and stay with us, and tell me in the comments which part struck you most, or whether this was the kind of vanished work someone in your own family still remembered. Because once you have seen the executioner clearly, you begin to notice how much of the old world still walks beside us, unnamed.